Hello everyone, and welcome back to Deep Chronicles World. Before you cozy up and drift off into dreamland, I've got a fun idea. Why not drop a comment below and share where in the world you're tuning in from? And hey, if you're enjoying these stories as much as I love sharing them, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy, relax, and dive into tonight's tale. Ready? Let's begin. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you wish you'd never left the warmth of your home. Steve tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he pulled into the driveway of his suburban Oklahoma City home. His wife, Helen, sitting quietly beside him. They had just returned from a rare night out, a movie followed by a quiet dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant. It was their day off, a chance to unwind from the stress of Steve's demanding job as the vice president of a local bank. Helen had been quiet for most of the ride home, lost in thought, but Steve didn't mind. He was just glad to have spent the evening with her, away from the pressures of work. As they entered the garage, Steve pressed the button to close the door behind them, the mechanical whirring filling the silence. But before the door could fully close, another car sped in behind them, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. Steve froze, his heart pounding as two men stepped out of the car. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by hats and scarves. One of them approached Steve's window, tapping on the glass with the barrel of a gun. "Mr. Steve," the man said, his voice calm but firm, "we're from the federal police. We need you to come with us." "This is a matter of your safety and your life," Helen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Steve remained silent, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't right. Federal officers wouldn't approach him like this in the middle of the night in his own garage. But before he could react, the man opened the car door and pulled Steve out, shoving him against the wall. Helen screamed, but the other man was already at her side, his gun trained on her. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the first man said, his voice low and menacing. Steve's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Were these men? What did they want from him? But why had they chosen him, of all people? As the men forced Steve and Helen into their house, Steve couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Little did he know, this night would unravel a story of crime, betrayal, and a criminal mastermind whose brilliance was matched only by his ruthlessness. This was the night that would change everything. The man who had orchestrated this nightmare was Terry Connor. It's a name that would soon become synonymous with fear and infamy. Terry's journey into the world of crime had begun decades earlier. In a small California town where he had grown up as the quiet, skinny kid who always seemed to be the target of bullies. Born in 1944 to a modest family, Terry had always felt out of place, as if he didn't belong in the world around him. He was intelligent, far more so than his peers. But his sharp mind was often overshadowed by his social awkwardness and the mild mental disorder that made it difficult for him to connect with others. Terry's parents did their best to provide for him, but they were struggling to make ends meet, and their attention was often divided between work and their other children. As a result, Terry spent much of his childhood alone, lost in his own thoughts and dreams. It was during these solitary moments that he began to develop a fascination with puzzles and problem solving. He would spend hours analyzing complex problems, breaking them down into smaller, more manageable parts until he found a solution. This skill would later become the foundation of his criminal career, but for now, it was just a way for Terry to escape the harsh realities of his life. As he grew older, Terry's intelligence and analytical mind began to manifest in more sinister ways. He started small, stealing from local businesses and experimenting with different methods of breaking and entering. At first, it was just a way to prove to himself that he could outsmart the system. But as his confidence grew, so did his ambitions. By the time he was in his early 20s, Terry had set his sights on a much bigger target: banks. His first major heist was a small bank in Arizona, a place he had chosen because of its minimal security and remote location. Terry spent weeks planning the operation, studying the bank's layout, the routines of its employees, and the weaknesses in its security systems. When the day finally came, Terry executed the plan flawlessly, slipping into the bank unnoticed and making off with a modest sum of money. It wasn't a life-changing amount, but for Terry, was a victory of proof of concept that he could pull off something far more ambitious. The success of the heist fueled Terry's ambition, and he began to dream bigger, envisioning a life of wealth and power achieved through carefully planned heists. But his early successes also attracted the attention of law enforcement, and it wasn't long before Terry found himself behind bars. For most people, prison would have been the end of the road, but for Terry, it was just the beginning. Behind bars, he honed his skills, networked with other criminals, and laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history. It was during his time in prison that Terry met Joseph, a hardened criminal with a reputation for violence and fearlessness. Joseph, born in 1939 in Philadelphia, had a long history of highway robberies and scams. Like Terry, who relied on his intellect and planning, Joseph was the muscled enforcer who could intimidate and overpower anyone who stood in his way. The two formed an unlikely partnership, with Terry as the mastermind and Joseph as the executor of their plans. Together, they began to recruit other criminals, assembling a gang that would help them carry out their heists. Terry's meticulous nature and Joseph's brute force made them a formidable team. They developed a system for their operations, which involved kidnapping bank managers and their families, forcing the managers to open the banks, and then making a swift escape. The gang operated with strict rules. No children were to be involved. In the kidnappings, no harm was to come to the hostages, and all members were to disguise themselves to avoid identification. After each heist, the gang would split up, making it difficult for law enforcement to track them. Terry also insisted that the stolen money be converted into diamonds, which were easier to hide and transport. This level of planning and discipline allowed them to carry out multiple heists without getting caught, but it also made them a prime target for law enforcement agencies determined to bring them to justice. The heist in Oklahoma City on December 28, 1982, was one of their most audacious plans. Steve, the bank's vice president, was the perfect target. He had no children, lived in a quiet neighborhood, and had access to the bank's security systems. Terry and his gang executed the plan flawlessly, holding Steve and Helen hostage overnight and forcing Steve to open the bank the next morning. The gang managed to steal $270,000 in just 30 minutes, leaving no trace of their identities. However, Steve's quick thinking allowed him to alert the police after the gang had left, leading to a massive manhunt. The police were baffled by the sophistication of the operation and realized they were dealing with a highly organized and experienced criminal group. As they dug deeper, they uncovered a pattern of similar heists across multiple states, all bearing the hallmarks of Terry and Joseph's methods. The detectives assigned to the case knew they were up against a formidable adversary, but they were determined to bring the gang to justice. The investigation led them to Terry's girlfriend in California, where they hoped to find clues about his whereabouts. However, Terry's meticulous planning and ability to stay one step ahead of the law made it difficult for the police to track him down. Terry and Joseph's partnership was the stuff of legends, a perfect blend of brains and brawn that made them nearly unstoppable. After their initial meeting in prison, the two quickly realized they complemented each other in ways that neither had experienced before. Terry, with his razor-sharp intellect and knack for meticulous planning, provided the blueprints for their operations. Joseph, on the other hand, brought the raw power and fearlessness needed to execute those plans without hesitation. Together, they began to build a criminal empire, recruiting a small but loyal group of accomplices who shared their vision of wealth and power. The gang's first major operation outside a prison was a bank heist in a small town in Nevada. Terry had spent weeks studying the bank's security systems, identifying weaknesses, and mapping out escape routes. Joseph, meanwhile, handled the recruitment of the team, selecting individuals who were skilled, reliable, and, most importantly, willing to follow orders without question. The heist itself was a masterpiece of precision and timing, and his team entered the bank just as it opened, disguised as maintenance workers. They quickly overpowered the security guards and took the bank manager hostage, forcing him to open the vault. Within minutes, they had emptied the vault of its contents, stuffing the money into duffel bags and making their escape through a back alley. The entire operation took less than 15 minutes, and by the time the police arrived, the gang was long gone. The success of the heist solidified Terry and Joseph's reputation as the most dangerous criminals in the country. And it wasn't long before they began to attract the attention of law enforcement agencies at the highest levels. But Terry and Joseph weren't content to rest on their laurels. They knew that the key to staying ahead of the law was to constantly evolve and adapt their methods. After each heist, Terry would analyze what had worked and what hadn't, making adjustments to their plans to ensure they stayed one step ahead of the authorities. Joseph, meanwhile, focused on expanding their network of contacts, forging alliances with other criminal organizations and securing safe houses where the gang could lay low between jobs. One of the most significant changes Terry made to their operations was the introduction of psychological tactics. He realized that fear was a powerful tool, one that could be used to control not only their victims, but also the police. In one particularly daring heist, Terry and Joseph kidnapped the family of a bank manager and held them hostage overnight, threatening to harm them if the manager didn't cooperate. The next morning, the manager opened the bank for them, and the gang made off with over $500,000 in cash and valuables. The psychological impact of the heist was profound, not only on the victims, but also on the law enforcement officers tasked with bringing the gang to justice. The police were baffled by the gang's ability to strike with such precision and disappear without a trace, leaving behind only fear and confusion in their wake. As the gang's reputation grew, so did their ambitions. Terry began to dream of pulling off the ultimate heist, one that would cement their place in criminal history. He spent months planning the operation, studying the security systems of some of the most heavily guarded banks in the country. Eventually, he settled on a target, the First National Bank of Oklahoma City, one of the largest and most secure banks in the region. The bank's vault was rumored to contain millions of dollars in cash, gold, and other valuables, making it the perfect target for Terry's grand plan. But pulling off the heist would require more than just careful planning and brute force. It would require a level of coordination and discipline that few criminal organizations could achieve. Terry knew that the key to success lay in the gang's ability to work together as a single, cohesive unit, each member playing their part to perfection. To that end, he implemented a strict set of rules for the gang to follow. No one was to act independently or deviate from the plan in any way. Every detail, from the timing of the heist to the escape route, was carefully calculated and rehearsed. Terry also insisted that the gang avoid unnecessary violence, believing that it would only draw more attention from the police. Instead, he relied on intimidation and psychological manipulation to control their victims, a tactic that had proven highly effective in their previous heists. The night before the heist, Terry gathered the gang for a final briefing. They met in a secluded safe house on the outskirts of Oklahoma City, far from prying eyes. Terry laid out the plan in meticulous detail, going over every step of the operation and answering any questions the gang members had. Joseph, meanwhile, inspected the weapons and equipment they would be using, ensuring that everything was in perfect working order. As the meeting drew to a close, Terry looked around the room at the faces of his team. These were men and women who had put their trust in him, who had followed him into some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. He knew that the success of the heist depended on their ability to work together, to trust each other implicitly. "Remember," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this isn't just about the money. This is about proving that we're the best, that no one can stop us. If we stick to the plan and stay focused, we'll walk away with more than just a payday. We'll walk away with our freedom." The gang nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. They knew the risks, but they also knew the rewards, okay? And they were ready to do whatever it took to succeed. The next morning, the gang put their plan into action. Terry and Joseph led the team into the bank, disguised as federal agents. They moved with precision and confidence, their years of experience evident in every step they took. The bank's security guards were caught off guard, their training no match for the gang's ruthless efficiency. Within minutes, the gang had taken control of the bank, herding the employees and customers into a corner and securing the area. Terry approached the bank manager, a middle-aged man named Steve, and demanded that he open the vault. Steve hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. But Terry's cold, calculating gaze left no room for doubt. "Open the vault," Terry repeated, his voice low and menacing, "or we'll start shooting." Steve nodded, his hands trembling as he entered the code into the vault's security system. The heavy door swung open, revealing stacks of cash, gold bars, and other valuables. Terry's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he motioned for the gang to start loading the money into their duffel bags. The heist was going exactly as planned, but as the gang worked, Terry couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had spent months planning every detail of the operation, but there was always the possibility of something going wrong. He glanced around the room, his eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. That's when he noticed it, a small, blinking, red light on the ceiling. It was a security camera, one that he had missed during his initial reconnaissance of the bank. Terry's heart skipped a beat as he realized the implications. The camera was still active. It meant that the police could be watching them, right? Now, tracking their every move. He quickly motioned for Joseph to join him, pointing out the camera. Joseph's face darkened as he understood the situation. "We need to move," he said, his voice tense. "Now." Terry nodded, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. They had planned for every contingency, but this was something they hadn't anticipated. The gang finished loading the money into the duffel bags and made their way to the exit, their movements quick and deliberate. But as they stepped outside, they were met with a wall of police cars, their lights flashing and sirens blaring. The gang had walked right into a trap. The sight of the police cars surrounding the bank sent a wave of panic through the gang. Terry's mind raced as he tried to process what had gone wrong. He had planned every detail of the heist with meticulous precision. Somehow, the police had been one step ahead. The blinking red light on the security camera flashed in his mind, a glaring oversight that now threatened to undo everything they had worked for. Joseph, standing beside him, clenched his fists, his eyes darting around as he assessed the situation. The gang members behind them froze, their faces pale with fear. Terry knew they had only seconds to make a decision. "Back inside," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The gang obeyed without hesitation, retreating into the bank and slamming the door shut behind him. Terry's mind was a whirlwind of calculations as he tried to figure out their next move. The police had them surrounded, but they still had hostages: Steve, the bank manager, and a handful of employees and customers. If they played their cards right, they might still be able to negotiate their way out of this, okay? But Terry also knew that time was not on their side. The longer they stayed inside the bank, the more likely it was that the police would storm the building, okay? They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. Inside the bank, the atmosphere was tense. The hostages huddled together in a corner, their faces filled with fear. Terry approached Steve, his gun trained on the trembling man. "You," he said, his voice cold and steady, "are going to help us get out of here. You do exactly as I say. No one gets hurt. But if you try anything stupid..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Steve nodded, his hands shaking as he raised them in surrender. Terry turned to Joseph and the rest of the gang, his mind racing as he formulated a plan. "We're going out the back," he said. "There's a service entrance that leads to an alley. If we move fast, we can make it to the cars before the police realize what's happening." Joseph nodded, his expression grim but determined. The gang members exchanged nervous glances, but said nothing. They trusted Terry, and they knew that their only chance of survival was to follow his lead. Terry handed Steve a phone and instructed him to call the police. "Tell them we're coming out," he said, "and tell them that if they try to stop us, we'll start shooting the hostages." Steve hesitated, his hands trembling as he dialed the number. Terry watched him closely, his finger resting on the trigger of his gun. He knew that one wrong move could mean the end for all of them. Outside, the police were preparing for a standoff. The bank was surrounded, with officers positioned at every exit. The SWAT team was on standby, ready to storm the building if necessary. The police chief, a grizzled veteran named Detective Harris, stood at the front of the barricade, his eyes fixed on the bank's doors. He had been tracking Terry and Joseph for months, and he wasn't about to let them slip through his fingers. Now, when the call came in from Steve, Harris listened carefully, his jaw tightening as he heard the demands. "We're coming out," Steve said, his voice shaking. "If you try to stop us, they'll start shooting the hostages." Harris clenched his fists, his mind racing as he tried to figure out the best course of action. He knew that Terry and Joseph were dangerous, but he also knew that he couldn't risk the lives of the hostages. After a moment of tense silence, Harris made his decision. "Let them go," he said to his team. "Follow them. We'll get them when they least expect it." The officers nodded, their faces set with determination. They had been chasing Terry and Joseph for too long to let them escape now. Inside the bank, Terry and his gang were preparing to make their move. They had gathered the hostages together and were using them as human shields as they made their way to the service entrance. Terry led the way, his gun trained on Steve as they moved through the bank's corridors. Joseph brought up the rear, his eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. The gang members followed closely behind, their duffel bags filled with cash and valuables slung over their shoulders. As they reached the service entrance, Terry paused, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped outside, his gun pressed against Steve's back. The alley was empty, but Terry knew that the police were watching. He motioned for the gang to follow, their movements quick and deliberate. They made their way to the cars parked at the end of the alley, their eyes darting around for any signs of the police. Terry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as he tried to anticipate the police's next move. He knew that they wouldn't let them go without a fight, but he also knew that they had the upper hand for now. As the gang piled into the cars, Terry kept his gun trained on Steve. "You're coming with us," he said, his voice cold and steady. "The police tried to follow us. You're the first one to go." Steve nodded, his face pale with fear. Terry shoved him into the back seat of one of the cars and climbed in after him, his eyes scanning the alley for any signs of movement. Joseph took the wheel, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he started the engine. The other gang members followed in a second car, their faces set with determination. As they pulled out of the alley, Terry kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of the police. He knew that they were being followed, but he also knew that they had a head start. If they could just make it to the highway, they might be able to lose the police in the traffic. But Terry also knew that the police wouldn't give up that easily. They had been chasing him and Joseph for too long to let them escape now. The car sped through the streets of Oklahoma City, their tires screeching as they rounded corners and weaved through traffic. Terry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as he tried to anticipate the police's next move. He knew that they would be setting up roadblocks and checkpoints, trying to cut off their escape routes. But Terry also knew the city like the back of his hand, and he had planned for this. He directed Joseph to take a series of back roads and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the police were likely to be waiting. The gang members in the second car followed closely behind, their eyes darting around for any signs of trouble. As they approached the highway, Terry felt a surge of hope. If they could just make it onto the open road, they might be able to lose the police for good. But as they merged onto the highway, Terry's heart sank. Up ahead, he could see a line of police cars blocking the road, their lights flashing and sirens blaring. The police had set up a roadblock. There was no way around it. Terry's mind raced as he tried to figure out their next move. They couldn't stop. If they did, they would be caught for sure. But they also couldn't risk a high-speed chase with the police. He glanced at Joseph, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. "We're going through," Terry said, his voice calm but firm. "Hold on." Joseph nodded, his jaw clenched as he pressed down on the accelerator. The car surged forward, its engine roaring as it sped toward the roadblock. The police officers scattered as the car barreled through the barricade, the sound of shattering glass and screeching metal filling the air. Terry's heart pounded in his chest as they raced down the highway, the police cars close behind. He knew that they were running out of time, but he also knew that they couldn't give up now. They had come too far to let the police catch them. As they sped down the highway, Terry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew that they needed to find a place to lay low, somewhere the police wouldn't think to look. He directed Joseph to take the next exit, leading them onto a series of back roads that wound through the countryside. Gang members in the second car followed closely behind, their faces set with determination. As they drove, Terry kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of the police. He knew that they were still out there, still chasing them, but he also knew that they had a chance if they could just stay one step ahead. The cars sped through the night, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they made their way to a remote safe house that Terry had prepared for just such an occasion. It was a risky move, but Terry knew that it was their only chance. As they pulled up to the safe house, Terry felt a surge of relief. They had made it for now. He also knew that the police wouldn't give up that easily. The chase was far from over. The safe house was an old, abandoned farmhouse tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods and miles of empty fields. Terry had chosen it for its isolation, knowing that it would be the last place the police would think to look. As the cars pulled up to the house, Terry felt a mix of relief and tension. They had made it this far, but the night was far from over. The gang members piled out of the cars, their faces pale and drawn from the adrenaline of the chase. Terry quickly ushered them inside, his eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. He knew that the police would be searching for them, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down now. Inside, the house was sparse and dusty, with only a few pieces of furniture and some basic supplies. Terry had stocked it with enough food and water to last them a few days. but it was far from comfortable. Still, it was better than being caught by the police. As the gang settled in, Terry took charge, his mind already working on their next move. He knew that they couldn't stay here for long. The police would eventually track them down, but they needed time to regroup and come up with a plan. He assigned Joseph to keep watch outside, while the rest of the gang members took turns resting and keeping an eye on the hostages. Steve, the bank manager, was still with them, his face pale and his hands trembling as he sat in a corner of the room. Terry approached him, his gun still in hand. "You're going to help us get out of this," he said, his voice cold and steady. "If you cooperate, you might just live to see another day." Steve nodded, his eyes wide with fear. He knew that he was in a dangerous situation, but he also knew that he had no choice but to do as he was told. Terry turned his attention to the rest of the gang, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. They had the money from the heist, but it was useless if they couldn't get away with it. He knew that the police would be watching all the usual escape routes, so they needed to come up with something unexpected. After a few moments of tense silence, Terry finally spoke. "We're going to split up," he said. "It's the only way to throw them off our trail. Joseph and I will take one car, and the rest of you will take the other. We'll meet up at the rendezvous point in 3 days. If anyone gets caught, they're on their own." The gang members nodded, their faces set with determination. They knew the risks, but they also knew that they had no other choice. Terry handed out fake IDs and cash to each of them, along with instructions on how to get to the rendezvous point. He also gave them strict orders to avoid drawing attention. Themselves, no flashy spending, no unnecessary risks. They needed to stay under the radar if they were going to make it out of this alive. As the gang prepared to leave, Terry pulled Joseph aside. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. Joseph nodded, his expression grim. The two men stepped outside, where they could speak without being overheard. "This isn't over," Terry said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "The police aren't going to stop until they catch us. Need to be ready for anything." Joseph nodded, his jaw clenched. "It's a plan?" he asked. Terry took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a solution. "We need to disappear," he said, finally, completely. "No more heists, no more risks. We take the money we have and we go underground. We change our names, our appearances, everything. We start over." Joseph frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "And what about the others?" he asked. Terry shook his head. "They're on their own," he said. "We can't afford to take any chances. If they get caught, they'll lead the police right to us." Joseph nodded, his expression grim but determined. He knew that Terry was right. They couldn't afford to take any more risks. It was time to cut their losses and disappear. As the gang prepared to leave, Terry felt a pang of guilt. He had led these people into this life, and now he was leaving them to fend for themselves. But he also knew that he had no other choice. The stakes were too high, and he couldn't afford to let sentimentality cloud his judgment. He gave the gang members one last look before turning away, his mind already focused on the next step. Joseph followed him to the car, his expression unreadable. The two men climbed in, and Terry started the engine, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As they drove away from the safe house, Terry couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. The road behind them was empty, the only sound, the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. The next few days were a blur of tension and paranoia. Terry and Joseph drove through the night, avoiding main roads and sticking to back roads and side streets. They stopped only to refuel and grab quick meals, always keeping an eye out for any signs of the police. Terry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as he tried to anticipate the police's next move. He knew that they would be searching for them, and he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As they approached the rendezvous point, Terry felt a surge of relief. They had made it thus far, but he also knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The rendezvous point was an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a small town. Terry had chosen it for its isolation and its proximity to the Canadian border. If they could just make it across the border, they would be home free. As they pulled up to the warehouse, Terry's heart sank. The place was deserted, with no sign of the other gang members. He knew that they had either been caught or had decided to go their own way. Either way, it was a setback, but Terry wasn't about to let it stop him. He and Joseph quickly unloaded the money from the car and carried it inside, their movements quick and deliberate. The warehouse was dark and musty, with only a few beams of light filtering through the cracks in the walls. Terry set to work, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. They needed to get across the border, but they couldn't risk using their usual methods. The police would be watching all the usual crossing points, so they needed to come up with something unexpected. After a few moments of tense silence, Terry finally spoke. "We're going to go by boat," he said. "It's a small fishing village about 50 miles from here. We can hire a boat and cross the border that way. It's risky, but it's our best shot." Joseph nodded, his expression grim but determined. He knew that they had no other choice. The two men quickly packed up the money and loaded it back into the car, their movements quick and efficient. As they drove to the fishing village, Terry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew that this was their last chance, and he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The stakes were too high, and the consequences of failure were too dire. When they finally arrived at the fishing village, Terry felt a surge of hope. The place was small and quiet, with only a few boats bobbing in the harbor. He and Joseph quickly found a fisherman who was willing to take them across the border for the right price. The man was old and grizzled, with a face weathered by years of hard work. He didn't ask any questions, and Terry didn't offer any explanations. They loaded the money onto the boat and set off into the night. The sound of the waves lapping against the hull, the only noise in the darkness. As they crossed the border, Terry felt a surge of relief. They had made it, They were free. But as they stepped onto Canadian soil, Terry couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. The police would be looking for them, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. They needed to disappear completely, to start over in a new life where no one would know their names or their past. It was a daunting task, but Terry knew that they had no other choice. They had come too far to turn back now. As they walked away from the boat, Terry felt a mix of emotions, relief, fear, and a strange sense of determination. They had escaped the police, but they were still far from safe. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Terry knew that they had what it took to survive. They were survivors, and they would do whatever it took to stay one step ahead of the law. The first few weeks in Canada were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Terry and Joseph kept a low profile, avoiding crowded places and sticking to small, remote towns where they were less likely to be recognized. They used the fake IDs Terry had prepared, posing as brothers who had moved north for work. The money from the heist was carefully hidden, divided into small amounts, and stashed in various locations to avoid drawing attention. Terry knew that they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. One wrong move, and their new lives would come crashing down. They rented a small, run-down cabin in the woods, far from prying eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them safe for the time being. Terry spent his days planning their next move, while Joseph handled the practicalities of their new life, buying groceries, maintaining the cabin, and keeping an eye out for any signs of trouble. The two men rarely spoke, their relationship strained by the weight of their situation, but they both knew that they needed each other if they were going to survive. As the weeks turned into months, Terry began to relax slightly. The police hadn't caught up to them, and it seemed like they might actually be able to start over. But Terry's mind was never at ease. He knew that the past had a way of catching up to you, no matter how far you ran. He spent hours each day scanning the news for any mention of their heist or the manhunt that had followed. So far, there had been nothing, but Terry knew that didn't mean they were in the clear. He also knew that they couldn't stay in the cabin forever. They needed to find a way to blend in, to become part of the community without drawing attention to themselves. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant vigilance and careful planning. One day, while Joseph was out running errands, Terry decided to take a risk. He drove to the nearest town, a small, sleepy place with a single main street and a handful of shops. He needed to get a feel for the area to see if it was a place where they could settle down without raising suspicions. As he walked down the street, Terry kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the locals. He stopped at a diner, ordering a cup of coffee and sitting in a corner booth where he could observe the room without being noticed. The place was quiet, with only a few customers scattered around the room. Terry listened to their conversations, picking up bits and pieces of local gossip. It seemed like a friendly, close-knit community, but Terry knew that could work both for and against them. On one hand, it would be easier to blend in if they became part of the community. On the other hand, strangers were always noticed in small towns, and Terry couldn't afford to draw any attention to himself as he sipped his coffee. Terry's mind wandered back to the heist. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at how well they had pulled it off. It had been a masterpiece of planning and execution, and Terry knew that it would go down in criminal history as one of the most daring heists of all time. But he also knew that it had come at a cost. The gang members they had left behind were either in prison or on the run, and Terry couldn't shake the feeling that he had abandoned them. He tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. They needed to find a way to start over, to build a new life where they could live in peace. But Terry knew that it wouldn't be easy. The past had a way of catching up to you, no matter how far you ran. When Joseph returned to the cabin that evening, Terry was waiting for him. He had spent the day thinking about their next move, and he knew that they needed to take action soon. "We can't stay here forever," Terry said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to find a way to blend in, to become part of the community. If we stay isolated like this, we're just going to draw attention to ourselves." Joseph nodded, his expression grim. He knew that Terry was right, but he also knew that it was a risky move. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Terry took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. "We need to find jobs," he said, finally. "Something low-key that won't draw too much attention. We can say we're brothers who moved here for work. If we can establish ourselves as part of the community, we'll be less likely to be noticed." Joseph frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "And what about the money?" he asked. Terry shook his head. "Okay, we can't touch it," he said. "Not yet. Need to live like we're broke, like we're just trying to make ends meet. If we start spending too much, people will notice." Joseph nodded, his expression grim but determined. He knew that Terry was right. They couldn't afford to take any risks. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Terry and Joseph found jobs at a local lumberyard, doing manual labor that paid just enough to cover their expenses. They kept to themselves, avoiding unnecessary conversations and sticking to their story about being brothers who had moved north for work. The locals were friendly but reserved, and Terry and Joseph did their best to blend in without drawing attention to themselves. It wasn't easy, but they managed to establish themselves as part of the community, albeit on the fringes. Terry knew that they couldn't afford to get too comfortable, but he also knew that they needed to build a life if they were going to survive. As the months passed, Terry began to relax slightly. The police hadn't caught up to them, and it seemed like they might actually be able to start over. But Terry's mind was never at ease. He knew that the past had a way of catching up to you, no matter how far you ran. He spent hours each day scanning the news for any mention of their heists or the manhunt that had followed. So far, there had been nothing, but Terry knew that didn't mean they were in the clear. He also knew that they couldn't stay in the cabin forever. They needed to find a way to blend in, to become part of the community without drawing attention to themselves. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant vigilance and careful planning. One day, while Joseph was out running errands, Terry decided to take a risk. He drove to the nearest town, a small, sleepy place with a single main street and a handful of shops. He needed to get a feel for the area, to see if it was a place where they could settle down without raising suspicions. As he walked down the street, Terry kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the locals. He stopped at a diner, ordering a cup of coffee and sitting in a corner booth where he could observe the room without being noticed. The place was quiet, with only a few customers scattered around the room. Terry listened to their conversations, picking up bits and pieces of local gossip. It seemed like a friendly, close-knit community, but Terry knew that could work both for and against them. On one hand, it would be easier to blend in if they became part of the community. On the other hand, strangers were always noticed in small towns, and Terry couldn't afford to draw any attention to himself. As he sipped his coffee, Terry's mind wandered back to the heist. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at how well they had pulled it off. It had been a masterpiece of planning and execution, and Terry knew that it would go down in criminal history as one of the most daring heists of all time. But he also knew that it had come at a cost. The gang members they had left behind were either in prison or on the run, and Terry couldn't shake the feeling that he had abandoned them. He tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. They needed to find a way to start over, to build a new life where they could live in peace. But Terry knew that it wouldn't be easy. The past had a way of catching up to you, no matter how far you ran. When Joseph returned to the cabin that evening, Terry was waiting for him. He had spent the day thinking about their next move, and he knew that they needed to take action soon. "We can't stay here forever," Terry said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to find a way to blend in, to become part of the community. If we stay isolated like this, we're just going to draw attention to ourselves." Joseph nodded, his expression grim. He knew that Terry was right, but he also knew that it was a risky move. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Terry took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. "We need to find jobs," he said, finally, "something low-key that won't draw too much attention. We can say we're brothers who moved here for work. If we can establish ourselves as part of the community, we'll be less likely to be noticed." Joseph frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "And what about the money?" he asked. Terry shook his head. "We can't touch it," he said. "Not yet. We need to live like we're broke, like we're just trying to make ends meet. If we start spending too much, people will notice." Joseph nodded, his expression grim but determined. He knew that Terry was right. They couldn't afford to take any risks. Life in the small Canadian town settled into a rhythm, though Terry's mind never fully relaxed. The days were filled with the monotony of manual labor at the lumberyard, while the nights were spent in the quiet solitude of their cabin. Terry and Joseph kept to themselves, avoiding unnecessary interactions with the locals. They became known as the quiet brothers who kept to themselves, a reputation that suited their need for anonymity. Terry's paranoia never fully subsided, though. He spent hours each night scanning the news, both local and international, for any mention of their heists or the manhunt that had followed. So far, there had been nothing, but Terry knew that didn't mean they were safe. The past had a way of catching up to you, no matter how far you ran. One evening, as Terry sat by the fireplace, his mind wandered back to the gang members they had left behind. He wondered what had happened to them, whether they had been caught, killed, or if they had managed to escape like he and Joseph had. He tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. They needed to stay focused, too, keep their heads down and avoid drawing attention to themselves. But the guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the life they had left behind. Joseph, on the other hand, seemed to have adjusted more easily to their new life. He spent his days working at the lumberyard and his nights tinkering with an old truck they had bought to get around. He rarely spoke about the past, and Terry didn't press him. They both knew that dwelling on it wouldn't do them any good. As the months passed, Terry began to feel a sense of cautious optimism. The police hadn't caught up to them, and it seemed like they might actually be able to start over. They had managed to establish themselves as part of the community, albeit on the fringes, and the locals had mostly accepted them as the quiet brothers who kept to themselves. Terry even allowed himself to think about the future, about the possibility of building a new life where they could live in peace, but he knew that they couldn't afford to get too comfortable. The past was always lurking in the shadows, waiting to catch up to them. One day, while Terry was at the lumberyard, he overheard a conversation that sent a chill down his spine. Two of his co-workers were talking about a news report they had seen the night before. "Did you hear about those bank robbers?" one of them asked. "The ones who pulled off that big heist down in the States. They say they're still on the run." Terry's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his face neutral, pretending to focus on his work. The other co-worker nodded. "Yeah, I heard about that. They say the police are offering a huge reward for any information leading to their capture. Can you imagine? Those guys must be living like kings somewhere, laughing at the cops." Terry's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that they couldn't afford to draw any attention to themselves. Not now. He finished his shift and headed back to the cabin, his mind racing. When he got home, Terry immediately turned on the radio, scanning the stations for any news about the heist. He found a station that was reporting on the manhunt, and his heart sank as he listened. The police were still searching for them, and the reward for information leading to their capture had been increased. Terry knew that it was only a matter of time before someone put two and two together. He turned off the radio and sat down, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. They couldn't stay here forever, but they also couldn't afford to run again. They needed to find a way to disappear completely, to start over, in a place where no one would know their names or their past. That night, Terry sat down with Joseph to discuss their options. "We can't stay here," Terry said, his voice low and urgent. "The police are still looking for us, and it's only a matter of time before someone figures out who we are. We need to find a way to disappear completely, to start over in a place where no one will know us." Joseph nodded, his expression grim. He knew that Terry was right, but he also knew that it wouldn't be easy. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Terry took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. "We need to change our identities," he said, finally. "New names, new appearances, everything. We need to become different people so that even if someone recognizes us, they won't be able to prove it." Joseph frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "And how do we do that?" he asked. Terry shook his head. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but we need to figure it out soon. We can't afford to wait." The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Terry spent hours researching how to create new identities, while Joseph handled the practicalities of their daily lives. They knew that they couldn't afford to make any mistakes, so they took their time, carefully planning every detail. Terry managed to get his hands on some fake documents, including new passports and driver's licenses. He also found a contact who could help them change their appearance's hair dye, contact lenses, even minor plastic surgery if necessary. It was a risky move, but Terry knew that they had no other choice. They needed to disappear completely to become different people if they were going to survive. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Terry felt a pang of regret. They had managed to build a life here, however fragile, and it was hard to let it go. But he also knew that they couldn't afford to stay. The past was catching up to them, and they needed to stay one step ahead if they were going to survive. They packed up their belongings and loaded them into the truck, their movements quick and efficient. Terry took one last look around the cabin, his mind filled with memories of the past few months. It had been a strange, quiet life, but it had been theirs. Now, they were leaving it all behind, stepping into the unknown once again. As they drove away from the cabin, Terry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that they had what it took to survive. They were survivors, and they would do whatever it took to stay one step ahead of the law. The truck rumbled down the dirt road, the sound of the engine filling the silence. Terry glanced at Joseph, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly, his expression unreadable. Body didn't speak, but they didn't need to. They both knew what was at stake, and they were ready to do whatever it took to stay free. The road stretched out ahead of them, long and uncertain. Terry knew that they were heading into the unknown, but he also knew that they had no other choice. The past was catching up to them, and they needed to stay one step ahead if they were going to survive. As they drove, Terry's mind wandered back to the heist, to the life they had left behind. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at how far they had come, but he also knew that the hardest part was still ahead. They needed to disappear completely to become different people if they were going to survive. It was a daunting task, but Terry knew that they had no other choice. They had come too far to turn back now. Despite their best efforts, Terry and Joseph managed to evade capture for years, continuing their spree of bank robberies and kidnappings. Their methods evolved, becoming more violent and daring with each heist. In one instance, Joseph tied a bank manager to a fake explosive belt, using psychological tactics to intimidate both the victim and the police. The gang's notoriety grew, and they became the most wanted criminals in the country. The police, however, were not giving up. They began to piece together information from informants and witnesses, slowly closing in on the gang. One of the key breakthroughs came when they arrested Kraft, a close associate of Terry and Joseph. After days of interrogation, Kraft revealed crucial details about the gang's operations, including the identity of John, their right-hand man. The police tracked John to a phone booth in San Francisco, where he was waiting for a call from Terry and Joseph. By tapping the call, they learned that the gang was planning another heist in Chicago. The police mobilized quickly, distributing photos of Terry and Joseph to all departments and setting up surveillance in the area. Their efforts paid off when they received a tip about a man matching Joseph's description, renting a room under a fake name. However, when they moved in to arrest him, they found Terry instead. Joseph had once again managed to escape, but the police were getting closer. The arrested Terry was a significant victory for law enforcement, but Joseph remained at large. The police continued their search, using every resource at their disposal to track him down. They discovered that Joseph had been living under various aliases, buying and selling cars to fund his operations. He had also started a family with a wife and child, which added a new layer of complexity to the manhunt. The police eventually located Joseph's hideout, a remote house on an island in the middle of a forest. They surrounded the property and waited for the right moment to strike. When Joseph finally emerged, he surrendered without a fight, bringing an end to his years on the run. The police found a stash of weapons, stolen money, and diamonds in the house, along with evidence of his involvement in numerous heists. Joseph's capture marked the end of an era for the gang, but the story was far from over. Terry, who had been in custody since his arrest, was brought in to testify against Joseph. The two were transported together for their trial, but Terry had one last trick up his sleeve. Using a hidden nail, he picked the lock on his handcuffs and freed himself and Joseph. They overpowered the officers, tied them up, and stole the police car, making a daring escape. The escape reignited the manhunt, and Terry and Joseph resumed their criminal activities with renewed vigor. They carried out several more heists, stealing millions of dollars and leaving law enforcement scrambling to keep up. Their methods became even more brazen, with the duo abandoning disguises and relying solely on their reputation to intimidate their victims. However, the pressure from law enforcement and the increasing number of informants began to take its toll. One by one, members of their gang turned themselves in, providing the police with valuable information about their operations. Final blow came when the police arrested John, the gang's right-hand man, and used him to track down Terry and Joseph. The two were eventually captured and sentenced to life in prison, bringing an end to their reign of terror. Their story, however, remains one of the most fascinating and complex tales of crime and punishment in American history. It is a testament to the lengths to which individuals will go in pursuit of wealth and power, and the relentless determination of law enforcement to bring them to justice. The legacy of Terry and Joseph serves as a reminder of the thin line between brilliance and madness, and the consequences of crossing it. See you tomorrow.